Hey, we are live. Welcome, Internet. Let's try to get like my shirt collar right. Hey, everybody. Chris Rogers here, educator, innovator. Oh, I forgot to do my little tag. I'm gonna do that in the middle of the session. But we're here. Make Cycle 3. Level up your game design. We got a couple new friends with us today, and even got a scratch. What's going over there? Who's that?
Hey, it's
Oh,
just Chad.
oh. And we got just Chad on
Yeah,
there
I'm
on
gonna make
scratch.
something. I'm gonna make something while we make them here.
Great. So you can always sort of like tune into that making going on over there. But I'm just going to pass it over to our guest today. Hey, how's it going?
Cool. Thanks so much for inviting us on. This is our, just so everyone knows, this is our first time part of the Make With Me cycle process, and we're really excited. My name's Paula, so I'm the community manager for Glass Lab. And some of you may know we're a nonprofit 501c3 that is focused on game-based learning, specifically high-impact digital games that are made for the classroom. And each of the games come with real-time reports that kind of help make that learning visible, and we love to focus on 21st century skills, which can be really difficult to teach. We've been a long partner of Educator Innovator. We started out just kind of like sharing key learnings with each other, and eventually translating to sharing experiences, especially projects. National Writing Project, for instance, helped create Mars Generation 1 Argubot Academy, which was also done with NASA, and it's a robot battle game focused on argumentation. And you can definitely take a look at that on glosslabgames.org. But I'll stop the spiel and hand it over to Evan really briefly to give himself an intro.
Hey everyone, I'm Evan Rushton. I was a former math teacher for 8 years in Northeast Los Angeles and a member of the Algebra Project. And I currently do learning design and instructional design at Glass Lab. So basically what that means in a nutshell is trying to make sure that the game mechanics that we're working on with game designers and artists align with the learning progressions that we're targeting when we target competencies that have been highlighted by middle school teachers and upper elementary school teachers as needs in their classrooms, things that they see their students are having trouble learning. And so trying to bridge that as well as supporting teachers in the classroom. So just I work on kind of instructional design, meaning, you know, how can we get games to actually work in the class, you know, and not be a distraction for learning, but actually a support for learning. So yeah, that's what I'm about. And hopefully everyone's having a good time making some games. We got Scratch Live, which is always a good time. I've got some Post-its going on in my sideboard over here, and yeah, let's make some cool stuff.
Cool. And so when we were thinking about how to do this mic cycle, especially since it's the first time we've kind of done it, we were like, okay, what can we tackle that's reasonable? The objective that we really wanted to accomplish was we wanted to enable everybody in the educator innovator community to use game design principles to really break down complex problems and talk about them with their kids. So when we're talking about digital games and we're talking about the evolution of games and what value they can bring, a lot of the discussion is really focused on formative assessment, which is really cool. Like, how do you measure learning in real time? How can you assess in real time whether or not kids are learning something? But we eventually kind of took a step back and tried to figure out, well, we've been playing games since we could possibly remember. We've been adhering to rules, creating rules, breaking the rules, and learning what happens when we don't adhere to the rules forever. And games have this huge opportunity to spark curiosity. And so we got to thinking, like, how do games enable us to spark discussion, especially with complex topics. And we figured that we would start out with one of the processes that we've kind of used whenever we're talking about the work we're doing. A lot of work on the game design side, especially with Michael John and Aaron Hoffman, who are two of our primary game designers. They created a kind of game design handbook that you can find on the site, and there's a game jam process that we kind of go through, which is really fun. And the first step is to really identify the problem. So what if you're thinking about issues like nuclear disarmament or a social issue that you really care about, like equity, what is the specific problem that you're really looking to address, and what are some of the characteristics of that problem? So if you're thinking about the types of variables, the potential players and characters within a system, what are the potential actions that you can take or those characters can take, and what are those potential outcomes that may happen as a result of you taking those actions? And what happens if you change a rule or change what a character is able to do? How does that invoke a new response? And then going to more into what's it like to be in that problem space. So if you're experiencing this problem and you're experiencing these outcomes, what does success and failure really look like for you? How do you want to address success, and how do you want to address failure? And you can relate this to a lot of the things that are happening in our own country right now. And one of the interesting things that we have really learned is that regardless of what age you're in, regardless of what industry or field you're in, regardless of your field of expertise, there's always this kind of sense of emotion behind all of the actions that you have, and all of the intended outcomes that you want to take. And a really tangible example that I think we can start with, it doesn't have to go into video games. It could go into card games and board games that you know and love. So taking Monopoly, for example, it really started out, it was created by Katie Maggie, to kind of talk about the plight and pitfalls of the real estate industry. The game includes play money, includes properties, had 9 rectangular pieces. You had to go to jail, swear, and yield $100 whenever you crossed it. And it's very applicable to the real world today. But it started out as this kind of anti-monopolist set, in which instead of everybody being rewarded when anybody progressed further, the goal was to create monopolies and crush opponents. So that's kind of probably one of the reasons why we all know Monopoly and hate to play it, and why probably no one ever finishes a game of Monopoly. And it's really interesting because originally, it was created to kind of show, like, you know, if you are playing the real estate game, the further you get along, the harder it is for other people to catch up. And so instead of buying out properties, you're forced to rent, you're forced to pay fees, and it's really difficult for people to kind of keep on a level playing field. But Parker Brothers saw the Monopoly piece of the game, thought that was really exciting, and created a standard set of rules that really focused on furthering adding to the pot of the people who are already doing well in the first place. And it's really interesting and indicative of kind of how a critical social issue can be translated to a board game and yield positive and negative effects. And Evan had told me last week that he actually saw an interesting example of what happens when you change one of the rules in the game. And I'd love for you to kind of go into what you saw.
Yeah, totally. So basically, I was looking through some of the previous CLMOOC shares from last year, and Kim Douillard's been doing a great job of kind of implementing some game mechanics throughout the CLMOOC make cycles these couple weeks, and I really love that. And I noticed that she had a blog link, and unfortunately I'm not logged into the chat role right now, and it was not auto-logging me in, so I'm sorry I'm not being able to share stuff. But anyway, I'll find a way. I'll share it here, and someone will share it there. And so basically, in this blog post, she talks about how in one of their summer institutes, they played Monopoly, in which they had to stagger their participation, and so it would be 2 players randomly chosen started to play Monopoly. Then the next 2 players came in 20 minutes later after like 5 or 7 cycles around the board from the first 2 players, and then the next 2 players came in after another 5 cycles around the board. And so even though the rules of Monopoly hadn't changed, they changed the beginning and the starting circumstances of the game, and then that kind of from that they were able to have some discussions around equity and different situations that people face who maybe are in disadvantaged situations and are like starting out with less. And I thought that was a really beautiful example of how you can change a very small aspect of a game and really change the outcomes of the game. Not to say that Monopoly has kind of like utopian kind of outcomes in the first place, but you know, you can really highlight some disadvantages that we see in the real world around us by changing some small aspects of the rules. So wanted to share that with everyone in case they weren't around last year or didn't see that blog. That was kind of in the beginning of before the first make cycle. And on top of that, I also just kind of wanted to kind of share along with, if anyone's struggling, I noticed that, some people seem to be struggling with this cycle in terms of coming up with an idea for a game. It's an iterative process making a game. So similar to like the remediation cycle that we had last week, just get started with really simple mechanics and really simple actions, because you're not going to usually end up with your end product in your first iteration. And so, it's fine to start really small with some basic objects.
Yeah, for sure. Just to piggyback off of that as well. I mean, for me, it's definitely been a learning experience. My background was in the for-profit commercial game development, the really, really big games where you would have like 50 million actions you'd have to take and a bunch of quests and sub-quests and so on. And a really critical thing to think about when you're trying to keep game design simple before you're more experienced and you're more excited to take on more adventurous core loops, is that good loops start out usually with 2 to 3 actions. So if you're talking about core verbs, what are 2 to 3 core actions you can take? Can you invest? Can you purchase? Can you nurture? Thinking about things in terms of noun and verbs has been really helpful, especially for me. And then you can kind of make it more complex. So if you're thinking of another example, so if you're thinking of the game Risk, there are games that all use actions that can repeat into each other. So in one turn you're attacking, in one turn you're defending your territory, and in another turn you're fortifying your existing territory so that it's really hard for other people to invade. And those decisions kind of can get caught in a loop. So another thing to kind of keep in mind is that at which point is it no longer fun? At which point do you feel like there's something I should be changing in order to either further my own goals or further that of the characters I'm trying to represent? And that definitely yields some interesting outcomes. I know that one of the things that a few of the kids who are playtesting SimCity EDU, which is the educational version of the actual commercial product, a lot of them were thinking like, oh, I just have to keep building factories. And if I keep building factories, then I will achieve my energy goal. But they had a negative result, which is like they increased pollution, their city happiness, overall aggregate happiness, started to decrease, and it caused them to think, well, okay, I'm committing to these 1 or 2 actions, and they're not actually reaping positive benefit for me. What do I need to change in that core loop in order to achieve all of my intended outcomes? And I thought that was really interesting. But to take a brief step back, I would love to see what Chad has created in Scratch. And it looks to be super elaborate. So what's been going on?
All right. So let me see. I gotta go back here. There we go. Can people see that? Relatively, whatever.
Yeah.
So over on the G+ community today, we were talking about the game. Do any of you play the game? Does anybody here, apart from Chris, know what I mean if I say I lost the game?
Unfortunately, yes.
Oh, there you go. Well, if you were playing, you should have just lost the game along with me, right? So
I know.
if you play the game, you have to not think about the game, and anytime you think about the game, you have to say, I just lost the game. And then the other people around you who are playing, if they're playing, in good faith, they'll say it too, and you get kind of a silly, happy, failing together community wherever you go. So I'm just going to set up an I lost the game for people to mix with their own sprites.
I'm getting War Games flashbacks really bad.
Yeah,
like the computer is telling me to not play.
You press the space bar right now. It says I lost. And then you keep track of how many times you lose the game during CLMOOC if you just want to leave this window open or something like that. But I'm going to go and put some bling on there.
I'm seeing a lot of people in the chat right now love losing the game. Awesome.
Yeah, funny story. I'll just interject real quick. Me and Bob from the writing project, Christina was telling us about this earlier, and we were like, "So how does this thing work? And I don't get it. What's the part of the game?" And if I can use that just to make a connection, a conversation that's been happening in the chat room has been about sort of like engaging with games. Some people are finding it more slippery to really get in. And what does it look like in a game? I think like what do have you noticed like how has it been in your experience like slippery to get involved with games? And what do you think that is? And also for the folks who are sort of like looking for things to make, and we'll try to get a couple of those people in the call. What do you think is a great starting point?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm sure Paula will add. I just wanted to start with the point that we were trying to make it a little bit easier to get into by suggesting that people take games that they already like, a game that they love, or a game that they've enjoyed playing or played recently, and just trying to do a remix of it, change one rule, change a small mechanic, and see what that does to the game and how that makes it different. But I feel like maybe by doing that, it constrains it so much, and people who are like highly creative group in the CLMOOC community are like, well, I want to create something of my own, and I want to kind of be original. And I think that's when you just open up that space. There's so much there, but at the same time, you want it to be a complete loop. You maybe have one cool mechanic idea, but then you don't know how to make it feed back into itself. You don't know how to make it so that it's like a continuous cycle. And so I think the fact that there's a lot of openness and room for, it's just getting out of control, is what makes it a little bit hard to contain. But that being said, focusing on the actions, what are the actions in your game, what are the things that the player can choose to do. If there are players in your game, there may not be. It may be something that just runs autonomously, but usually there's some sort of action in the game. And so if you can just identify the main actions you want to have, then that's going to be a good starting place, I think, at least in my mind, in terms of I'm going to get something going right now.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that to definitely piggyback off of that, one of the ways in which I've been able to kind of tackle what it's like to design a game is to start with something that you really care about. So when you're thinking about the core verbs and you're thinking about the character you're representing, or you're thinking of yourself within a game, and if you are thinking about things in terms of, say for instance, you want to create a game that is focused on the California drought, and I've kind of like implied this in the newsletter post, and this was kind of the thing that I was thinking of, like, well, if I were to create a game focused on a social issue or an environmental issue, like where would I start? And for me, if I were, say, a character in a game, and there were 3 things I could do, I could water my lawn, I could take shorter showers, I could do another thing, or like use tap water instead of bottled water. How do those actions impact, say, my aggregate water level if I'm looking at a meter on a screen? That's definitely a way in which I've kind of started to tackle what it's like to think about games, and how the core loops could be represented. And another exercise that I've seen someone do is they'll actually go around the house and be like, okay, my couch is home base. And I know that a lot of people with kids have probably played this at one point or another, especially if they're doing tag or hide and go seek. If the end objective is to get enough points so that you can get like a cookie from the cookie jar, or finish your homework at a later point, or sleep 10 minutes later, what are the key objectives and actions that the kids or players can take? Will they hide in a certain part of the corner that is less visited by a person? Are they going to just like squat on the couch and be like, I don't care, I'm breaking this rule and this is what I'm going to do? And I think using a variety of mediums and a variety of scenarios will be really helpful for kind of like wrapping your head around that. And it looks like there's another question as well on participating. And actually, sorry, I'm trying to think of what else makes it harder for people to grasp games. And I think a lot of it is just the fact that games nowadays can be really complex. It's kind of a black box. You don't necessarily know what goes into it. And so going back to kind of keeping things simple, but being not afraid to experiment, and if you reach a fail state in which the game is no longer fun, being okay with taking a step back and going like, okay, what can I change? And I think that would be really good. And taking another, yeah.
Oh, did you get the thing in the chat about? So one of our participants was like a game idea. I don't know if you all had a chance to see it yet.
Yeah, I was
Otherwise,
looking. This is just me, Guy, right? Or I'm sorry, I'm not pronouncing that
yeah,
right probably. But yeah, there's a game idea about stamping, teaching students how to give and get constructive feedback on their stories. And is the question around what tool to use to help to set this game in motion in the classroom, or is this around co-constructing the actions of this game? Because I see the need for a participatory, collaborative, creative space, and I'm wondering if the task is for us to discuss tools or to discuss the idea.
yeah. I think a great start would be the idea. And looking at, I think Paula laid out greatly, talking about like actions and action steps and what will be the like actions in this game. I think that will help to give, I guess, man, we can even sort of like remix it on our own if you feel like it goes a particular way, and that might help. And then we can start to think about tools. I think first securing the vision is probably where we want to go.
Sure. Cool. So if I'm reading it correctly, the idea would be that students would be able to kind of access a student's writing one at a time, and then they all would work on the same piece and using stamps to identify character settings, feelings, movement words, other stamps where they want more sensory details. And so we're talking about kind of giving constructive feedback in terms of maybe they feel like certain parts of the story are more engaging to them, or like giving them a more vivid experience, and how can we share that with the creator of this work, that this portion of the piece was really calling to me in some way, and what about it, what aspect of it was doing that for me. So some way to kind of code the writing in like a fun way, so that the creator of the piece would be able to see, oh, when I did that, it really worked for my readers, and when I did this piece, it wasn't getting as much attention, or they're asking for more here. I feel like that's what I'm hearing as like the overall idea. And so what are things about that we can either change, or what are things about that we feel are good ways to make that an engaging or immersive experience for like the players, which would be the students in this case?
Yeah. Chad's helping us out too. So I think he's like, I'm looking at his scratch window, and he's popping into the chat room and helping out and providing just me McGee. I like that. It's like just McGee, like Mr. McGee, but just McGee with some tools and whatnot. So he's helping us out too. I did want to note that one of the things that Christina Cantrill's been talking about in the chat room too, about like childhood games, right? And I think sometimes in the current way of thinking about the era of video games, and we think about all these like platforms and games and screens, but like when we were young, and I mean, as we still are, we playing like the hand games and hide and go seek, and those like physical and locational games, those kinesthetic games. Glass Lab also engage in those sort of things, and are there things that translate between those like kinesthetic games and locational games, or what's interesting about the screen games and those kinesthetic games and that relationship between the whole thing? I got to figure out how to get Paula back too. I have to figure that out.
Yeah, is she there? I thought she was gonna jump on, but maybe. Oh, she's off. I see. 1 second. I'm just gonna close this door because I don't want the background.
Yeah, it seems like she's frozen.
I see. Oh well, actually, then I'll just take it.
Okay, she's coming back.
Paula, are you back?
Yes, I am. Sorry, is that better?
Okay, did you hear the question? It was about what or to what extent does Glass Lab incorporate things from like kinesthetic games that we used to play as kids, like tag, laser tag, cartoon like toon tag, all the good stuff, hide and go seek, things like that. Like kinesthetic games, how does that kind of incorporate into what we do? Since all of our stuff ends up being kind of virtual digital games. And I mean, I guess my initial response to that is, all of our games start off as just paper prototypes in front of kids. We go to like after-school programs, or we go during school time, and when teachers will allow us to come in if they're working on like game design, that sort of thing, and we just get feedback from the kids on like whether or not the mechanics that we're proposing are engaging, and usually what the game ends up being is nothing like what we originally proposed. So we're just constantly iterating on the feedback, like how are students responding to this simple idea, this simple mechanic, does this seem to make sense for them? And so I think that's kind of, there is a kinesthetic piece to that, but then at the end of it all, it does end up being something that is just kind of, I guess static on a screen, since it's a video game.
Yeah, I think about a lot of that is also dependent upon the device, right? So depending upon the age group that you're kind of thinking of and the grade level in your classroom, other more like higher touch devices like iPads will be much more engaging than say a PC computer game. But like it's still thinking. It goes back. For me, it goes back to still thinking about core verbs and actions that you take in a game. So while you won't necessarily be running around, you do have some level of control as to what your character sees in the game, what you're allowed to touch, even if it's not physically touch, but you're touching a screen or you're using a mouse to kind of click through an environment in a system and interact with the individual variables that are inside it. And those are all definitely actions. And when we're thinking about how Ratio Rancher was developed, for instance. And it's kind of like a nurturing puzzle game where you are in charge of a kind of like creatures on a plane, and you kind of have to figure out and play with like what they can eat, what type of food do they respond to, and how many of them. And it's interesting because you'll have a lot of kids that kind of like interact a little bit more with the camera in the space. You'll have kids that experiment more with what type of food works and how to size their pens and how they're moving around, and they provide really interesting feedback as to how their own experiences and the emotional response that they kind of have with how the games are made will actually change the gameplay mechanics themselves. And I think that's been something that's been super interesting and very playful. So while it's not very physical or kinesthetic, there are aspects of the physical response you have or the emotional response you have. How you interact with a character on a screen can be just as exhilarating as if you were running down a field and your friend was catching up and you had 2 seconds to tag into the goal or something. Cool.
There's this very interesting chat that's happening in the chat room right now about all those childhood games that you remember. I'm thinking that Spoons has been one. Hot Hands. There's a YouTube video. I didn't click on it because I didn't want to mess anything up. But anybody have any you have any great ones that you know about? I don't know. Chat, you still here too?
Yes, I'm still here. I'm working on that start screen.
Oh, how's it going?
Make it as horrible as possible so that people feel hopefully empowered to change it. So yeah. Like I put into the chat earlier, I've been thinking a lot about, in particular, participatory and makery experiences for a long time now, but more recently, playground games that kind of teach more technical or domain-specific content, anything ranging from, imaginary obstacle courses to silly songs, like in thinking about, for example, how to move, say, web literacy from being part of web culture to being part of popular culture or mainstream culture or like school culture in the United States, for example. I don't know, just silly things come to mind, but I think they're very important. Like instead of singing the song, who stole the cookie from the cookie jar, if we're going to have a really like web literate future, which is something I hope,
Yeah.
I'm thinking now like, how do we shift that to be a song that's like, who put the DRM in my Minecraft jar? You know, it's silly, but I think coming up with things that are culturally resonant, powerful, and lasting, and early as playground games is important for having a more, I don't know what the right way to put it is, for having a society that is at once critical about technology but not afraid to use it for creative expression. And with that, I'm going back to my silly game.
Thanks, Chad. We haven't. Never mind. I was going to say you just lost the game, but
Oh, just keep
that's
happening.
things up.
It's the cycle.
I don't know.
It's a virtuous cycle.
Right. I don't. Yeah. Unless it's a win or a loss. But we have a new guest on the call. Mallory. Where are you there? Let's see. You got your mute on.
Hi. Yeah. Can you? So I had the video going on in the background, so I wanted to make sure I got it turned off before I got on the call. Do I sound okay?
Oh, awesome.
Cool.
You sound awesome. Great. Oh, welcome. So we were just coming out of sort of like the relationship between physical games and talking about like those rhyming games and how we can use those to teach, and how a number of people already use those to teach. I wasn't following the chat roll, but what brings you into the call? How's it going with gaming? How are you feeling this week?
You
Tell me how
know,
you're feeling this week, because it's good to know how you are.
I'm still kind of in the idea stages of the gaming. I think it's something that I feel like a lot of pressure in some ways with games, like because I want them to be entertaining and I want other people, you know, to want to join in and feel competitive. And I think when I think of some of the games that I really like, there's a lot of little moving parts that you don't really think about unless you're trying to think of a game that you want to create. And so I think I'm kind of still in the stage of like, how can I do something that's simple enough that people want to, you know, participate, but not so, you know, but also creative and fun. So that's kind of what I've been mulling with so far.
Yeah, for sure. I can definitely empathize with the swirling of ideas, for sure. One of the ideas that when Evan and I were thinking about, like, well, okay, let's make a game, like, and have people provide feedback on what makes sense. What should we change about the core loop if it doesn't work? And we were actually, when thinking about the Monopoly example, we're like, well, can we relate this to the Greek debt crisis going on right now? So if we were the upper middle class, or we were the IMF, or if we were just general middle class, not able to withdraw, trying to figure out whether or not their currency would really be meaningful, and trying to figure out how to operate within that broken system, would the core verbs be invest? Would you restrict? So if you were also a politician, would you create more austerity measures, and what would the potential outcomes for that be? If other players were middle class, what would happen to their abilities to move, especially if you were to create a board game? And would you be able to divest or withdraw? And some of those ideas have definitely raised interesting questions in my head. I don't know about you, Evan.
Let's see. Yeah, I'm trying to make sure that what I say is helping someone with their make. And so right now I'm being torn in like maybe 3 or 4 directions. But I think the main kind of advice for simplifying the problem is you can start in one of 2 places. You can either start with a really cool game idea that you think is like, oh, this is going to be a fun game for people to play, and then maybe try to embed content in it somehow. So like some cool exchange, like maybe you can get everyone on our chat roll to like say a phrase that starts with the word, you know, orange, and then people just start going, right? Or something like that. Because it's like kind of a cool mechanic and people will maybe just do it. But then how do I embed my content into this cool game idea? and it's simple, engaging, everyone can get in it really easy. But then another way to go is like start with the problem, start with what is the content that maybe I'm trying to teach, or how am I trying to get my students to engage, and then what are ways or actions that I can embed in that I already know the content that I want to teach, I already kind of know my structure there, but what are some actions I can change, what are some behaviors I can have the students doing that are going to add some more motion or a little bit more chaos to that structure, just so that they have more choice, they have a little bit more variety in terms of where they can take it, make it their own. So I think there are two starting places, and in either case it is still going to be tricky, but like as Paula was saying, we were starting with the idea of Monopoly, which is already there for us, it's already engaging, and then kind of saying, okay, well, let's take some social problem that we have experienced, heard about, or would like to maybe try to get people to think about or discuss, and how can we embed that within the game. So anyway, that maybe is helpful.
Yeah, and somebody brought up storytelling as a form of gameplay. One of the tools that I would definitely try out is Twine, or Twinery. I'm not exactly sure which the URL is, but which URL it is, but I'll find it and then I'll share it. But you can create individual nodes that actually just, you can write as many or as little, as much or as little as you want. I mean, you can start out with like, I'm sitting like home alone, I'm staring at my computer, it's been hours, things are fading in and out, you hear a sudden knock. And then you can actually create an action that goes like, do you get up? Or do you continue to flip through your magazine that's next to it? Or do you look down? Do you look out the window? And I think that exercises in writing with dynamic actions that you can actually click through and take the storytelling component a step further, and I think that's really interesting too. And a lot of I've seen a lot of examples, especially on Twine, of kids actually telling stories of like how to combat bullying or how to generate a sense of empathy or community, and there's been a lot of interesting examples, and I definitely highly recommend that as a tool to try out, especially with kids.
Yeah, I want to kind of continue with the same thread of storytelling. I think it's we talk about like games and stories and popular games and kind of being very specific to video games. Even though one of the things I do know about stories and games, right, is one of these like natural games that always comes up that I notice, right, is whenever an event sort of happens, right, you have like total internet communities, right, who are in a way competing to sort of like remix or retell that story in the most entertaining and funny way. And with this sort of collaboration, all to see who can come up with the most funny story. So like I feel like games and stories are connected in very interesting ways. And when I think about specifically like video games and storytelling implications and what stories work in games and what stories don't. I even noticed, Paul, that you have some sort of character on the wall behind you. And
yeah,
like, what's the story behind that guy?
If anyone's a Final Fantasy fan.
The Final Fantasy is one of like the biggest storytelling franchises. You know, it's like novels. That's also a interactive game. I don't know. I really find that interesting when talking about games and stories.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely an interesting way in which games have the capacity to spark this curiosity, and a lot of it has to do with scaffolding that content, right? So you'll go through a big role-playing game, and in terms of the genre, it's you're placed in the boots of a specific character that already has a background, and over the course of the game, they'll not only scaffold your skill development, but kind of ease you into what the background of that character is. And games have a really, really interesting way of kind of like sucking you in. And another example that I would I would cite is also Mass Effect, which was created by Electronic Arts and BioWare. And you started out as the soldier, and most of the time, like, you'll think like, oh, it's a fighting game, oh, it's like an adventure game, but you actually go through and make really interesting decisions about the people you interact with, and over time, it creates allegiances and impacts the ways in which other characters interact with you. And I've actually seen a few teachers kind of use that in another game called Assassin's Creed in their history courses to kind of be like, okay, this is what it was. This is what the social dynamic was like in a different context. But it was really interesting how that was used as a tool to cite to inspire further discussion. Sorry, I got briefly caught up by this actual question. So exquisite corpse sounds familiar. I don't know if that's an actual question. Does anybody on the chat know about that?
Oh, yeah, I know. Well, exquisite corpse. I'm just saying what I would type into the chat. I know it comes from like surrealism, right? And like artists, they would. It's like a surrealist game to be able to get at things, and it's multiple people. And I would love. I think it was. When was it? When did you talk about that? Well, please continue to talk about that in the chat. If you want to talk about it more, hey, DM me, and we can get you into the Wonka Beta, as I called it, to talk about it some more. Is Mallory? Mallory, you still here?
I'm here.
Hey, what you also have some connections with stories and games, right?
A little bit. I mean, last year it was really cool. I got to work. I was in Minu Rami's class a little bit in Philadelphia, and she did a really cool game storytelling unit with her seniors. It was cool because the class was more of like a creative writing class. So it was interesting to see how theirs was not digital. It was all kind of in the context of the class, and they created stories that kind of helped contextualize what their games were. And then in groups, students created those games. So some of those took the forms of like scavenger hunts. Others took the forms of like a maze that students had to go through. And so that was a cool way that I saw it kind of integrated into the writing classroom. So that's my experience that I got to observe, which was really cool.
Awesome. We have some things going on in the chat, but we were still, the Exquisite Corpse is mighty popular. The affordances of paper and the constraints of a synchronous audience from Katrina Kennett. I think that's really interesting. New technologies or can be constraining. Sometimes we don't think about that. Sometimes when we think about new technology and innovation, we usually think about the possibilities, but also what are the affordances of paper? That's very interesting. When we talk about games versus like board games and their development versus video games, what would you call it? Like the mode, the form in which the game takes, and its influence on how it's played. I don't know. Anybody got anything to say to that? Evan, Chad, you over there?
Oh, indeed. I would just say I think any kind of game in which there's clever storytelling, whether it's an example of Exquisite Corpse done visually, or if there's a little more structure to it, maybe like or a different kind of structure to it. I'm thinking about Storymatic and Whatchamadraw is games that I've seen middle schoolers kind of really get into elaborating and pushing out drawings and stories together. I think a little bit about older project that kind of got some new life recently, but might be worth looking up, called the Ivanhoe game, which was a lot like the newish platform Storium, which is for online world building and storytelling. I'm just all for people getting together and talking and building things together, and when it can be a game or it can be a game-like experience, I think there's a lot you can discover there and take away from that and bring back into whatever your professional practice is. So I would say whatever it is that interests you to have this conversation, like find a way to jump in and enjoy it this week. Like find a way to deeply enjoy something that you've heard about this week and reflect on it afterwards. But just play without fear of failure first.
I was just going to say, like, in terms of paper as a medium, and that's a lot of where our digital games actually start. And that kind of goes back to the tactile thing as well, where when we're interacting with our middle school kids and trying to figure out like what game mechanics work and what actually don't, we will start out a lot with paper prototypes, and that's definitely a way for us to keep things really simple and keep our actions really simple. And there's a lot of ways in which even the transaction of putting a card from one part of the table to the next or handing it to another kid will actually provide really interesting insights. And I love the fact that game design itself is really collaborative, and I'm really excited to see actually if there are any games where CLMOOC participants from like across the country will kind of start to participate in and engage in as a broader system. And I think that seeing the ways in which that interaction can evolve the system itself is really exciting, and it's kind of scary, right? Because change in any shape or form can be a little bit harrowing. But I think that that's all part of the process, and that's something that's really fascinating and unique about game design.
Oh, and I was also just saying, as you were talking about how students make those prototypes, it's also interesting to think about how a lot of classic board games are also in a digital form, like Game of Life or Settlers of Catan is like getting more popular, and that has a board game version and a digital version. So kind of seeing how games can take on different forms, but have the similar concepts, but adjusted for different contexts. Interesting thought.
I have a mad love for Settlers of Catan. I can never get enough sheep, though.
Yeah, Chad, is that Scratch game done over there? Seems like it's been sitting on that ready to go page. I would just want to click on the video and press it, but
it's done in so much as it's ready for people to kind of tear apart and do things to and with. As I kind of put in the chat roll, Scratch is a really novice-friendly, I think, place and community to start messing around with the block-based coding aspect of animation design or storytelling or coding. Oh, Tara, hello, Tara. And I'd certainly be interested in chatting with people about it anytime this week. But it has a very kind of low floor and high ceiling feel to it. And as you get rolling, you can kind of quickly assemble the things you know how to do and then start to see more possibilities, both for the technical side of arranging the blocks so the things on the screen, the sprites do what you want, but also for how would I storytell with this, what kind of moves in a game can I imagine doing with this. I just think it's a neat place to start for people who are curious about creating a game with a computer, but you can paper prototype your way towards that. You could look at it and think, I don't know how to do this here, but I could totally do this as a board game with some cardboard that's laying around the house. I think Scratch is a good provocation. So I made a Losing the CLMOOC game that people can go in. On Scratch, there's a blue button on each game that reads See Inside, so you can look inside of it and kind of see how it's put together and what the language is like. And then you can just change the numbers and change the words and break the game and see what happens as a way to see what each little kind of block of code is doing. So if I click on it, we'll go back to this view. But it's live. The link was in there somewhere. I can throw the link back in, and people, if it's useful to them, can just tear it apart and see what happens.
Hey, we got a new guest. Welcome.
Hey, Antero.
Hi, everybody. How's it going? I've been lurking in the chat for a while, so I figured I'd lurk here now too. That's all. Talk about losing the game as much as possible.
Yes. Antero, I want to hear about, because I love this example from your work, I want to hear about like experiential, shall we say, real-time, real-life role-playing games you might play for learning that aren't necessarily paper, board, or video game based.
Interesting. All right. Well, I think so. One game, maybe this is what Chad's talking about. A couple years ago, I was working with a professor at Berkeley, and we created an alternate reality game for my classroom called the Black Cloud game. And the basic gist was that the pollution in Los Angeles had gotten so bad that a cloud of pollution had gained consciousness and was communicating with my students through Twitter. And so that game was about engaging in the real world and measuring air quality and doing all of this sciencey and Englishy stuff, while also doing some awesome storytelling stuff at the same time. But the prototype for that game actually came about while I was on an airplane with my collaborator Greg. We just had some, I think we had like sugar packets from coffee, and I think we had some cardboard, and we made like a little game board and a map of South Central Los Angeles, and our prototype was that simple. And then it was a matter of telling a story about, well, what if the cloud did this, right? And I think just a simple game of what if, or yes and, right? Like just very kind of typical tropes for how you build stories is a useful way to construct stuff. But it's also about imagining, you know, what's the identity and what's the ways that you can take on a persona, right? So if I'm always scratching my chin with my left forefinger or something, is a forefinger a finger? I think so, right? That's a kind of finger. If I'm always doing the same gesture over and over, am I giving people a clue? And if so, what is it, right? And I think there's just some easy ways for us to start adding personas into role-playing, maybe. Chad, was this where you wanted me to go? I think I screwed up big time.
Yes, go there.
Excellent.
I'm typing things. I can't think twice at the same time.
Leave me alone. I'm losing the game.
I keep losing the game, guys. It's not
I just lost the game.
Yeah, I feel like losing is a big part of it too. Like that's something that's really not that really I wish was emphasized more. Like, yeah, you're going to like lose the game. I think so much in schools it's built of like we got to win. We always got to be winning. We're always trying to keep up. We always want the A. We always got to be keeping up that like losing games, right? And the sportsmanship and the character that is built. Even though, you know, they say there's no character wins, you know, professional sports. But I really enjoy the whole like losing part of it too. I think that's something that is enjoyable. It is like needed. I did want to now, Antero, and then Paul, would you kind of talk about it in the chat about the game jam? They had like a game jam with students recently, right?
Yeah, there was an awesome game jam that happened a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. I'm sure Christina in the chat will correct me on when the date was. But it was at the Critical Design and Gaming School down in South Central. And on a Saturday and Sunday, about 50 students showed up. About half of them built board games, about half of them built computer games. One built a 2-level platformer, which is crazy. And we rolled a die to figure out what the theme for the game jam would be, and the theme was apocalypse. So pretty much everybody made a zombie game for the weekend, and it was great. And some of the board games required, if you got bit by a zombie, it bit your arm, and you can no longer use that arm. So we were watching some kids playing this board game, and like all of their limbs were gone, right? So they were on the floor trying to roll their dice, you know, with their head or something. It was fun. It was a good time, and it was super successful, and just felt like really brought the community together over a couple of days.
I love how all of our topics, whenever Antero is involved, deals with the apocalypse somehow. But actually, just to piggyback off of that, especially when we're talking about game jams. So a couple months back, a few of our game designers actually had a game jam with a nonprofit called N Square, and they're really focused on agency and empowerment, and focused on the topic of nuclear disarmament. And so these are a bunch of adults, like there were no kids in the room, but they all actually had to go through this game design process and kind of like, how do you deconstruct a facet of this really complex, seemingly intractable problem? And so they went through, they identified individual components and actions that they could take, and a lot of them wanted to focus on like, well, how do we create empowerment and education so that people understand how critical this issue is? And so one of the teams had actually created a game that was focused on like purchasing fissile material from around the world. which created really interesting like ethical questions of like, well, am I creating a game that will make it really easy for people to understand how easy it is to acquire fissile material? And there also raised interesting questions of like, well, if it were a multiplayer game and another character was a person within a developing country who had to actually source the fissile material, what questions does that raise? And it actually resulted in this sort of paralysis. So you have a bunch of analysts who have very like comprehensive experiences in education and nuclear energy and policymaking, and a lot of them were actually paralyzed with the idea of like, well, what do I do? And we're talking about these real world actions that we can potentially take, and putting it in the game design context actually enabled them to kind of reframe, not necessarily completely rethink their thought process, but how do we address issues of inaction, and how do we create specific verbs that people could then learn about this and go, okay, this is something I can do. And I think that was a really interesting experience. But I think there's also another question on the chat of what was the last game you learned to play? Unless anyone wants to answer that question first.
Yeah, I was thinking about like saving that one for like our finale and kind of going through those because I'm still thinking about the last game. Well, other than this Chad's lost game, but I think.
Oh, it is not mine. It came to me the same way I've given it to you.
I don't want to start with mine, or maybe I should. Okay, the one I know was it's this game where you they say like fuzzy wuzzy is this and not that, and it's I learned it, but now I halfway forgot it. Because it's like trying to figure out, it's like if you use two consonants together, you win. If there's no double consonants, then you lose. Somebody in the chat room will figure this out. I know it will. So that's just my game.
Cool. I mean, I guess I can go next. So the game that I literally just started playing yesterday was a computer game called Wolf Among Us, made by Telltale Games. And I've only gotten through the first 2 chapters of the visual story. And then they were made by the game is made by the same people who made the Walking Dead game, if anyone else knows that. But essentially, you don't do a lot of physical action in the game. You kind of move around a little bit. A lot of the actions that you do in the game focus on the dialogue that you choose to have. And so it raises issues of empathy, actually, because you play this character who in an old world was the big bad wolf and is now a detective. So a lot of the content was focused on invoking the sort of responses in me that I would that I would have to kind of tackle if I were in a real life situation and I was dealing with an interaction that was a difficult conversation with another person. So that was very interesting for me.
Sorry, I couldn't get off of mute there for a second. I already mentioned the game I learned in the chat roll, but it's called Carcassonne, and it seems like a very simple game. It's basically you have pieces that you place together to create roads and create like connecting pieces, and you get points for having a player on different pieces. But what I was saying in the chat roll is that there's also very much a learning curve, like knowing the strategy of like what pieces are going to go where, or which pieces might not ever fit together, and therefore you want to get points for it and things like that. So it was one of those games where I learned to play and thought it was fun, but I was also really frustrated because I realized a lot of games you need to know that strategy of like what pieces, what works, what doesn't, how can I get the most out of it. So that was just a really interesting experience that I'm sure a lot of people experience with games too.
I just learned a new game called Spyfall, and I think it came from Russia because some of the culture. Well, I think the creator's name sounds Russian, and some of the cultural references seem slightly off. But basically, it's kind of a party game, so everybody is in a location, like an amusement park, except one person has a card that says they're a spy, and so you're not supposed to say what the location is, but you all ask each other questions like, hey, what do you eat when you're here? And you would try to suggest foods that would have what you would eat at the amusement park, but without revealing where you are, so the spy can't figure it out. You try to ask enough questions to figure out who the spy is, and the spy tries to ask enough questions to figure out what location they're in. And it's just a really easy game for people to play. And as soon as the spy asks a dumb question, it's ridiculously stupid and entertaining to see. It's one of those games where it just seems bananas after a little while. It's a good time.
I recently learned to play. Well, I guess I should just share one. So there's this game called Ascension, and it's a deck builder game made by some guys that are really good at Magic the Gathering. Slightly similar, but it's got simpler rules in terms of the number of cards, at least in the original sets. And so you get, I guess I'm not going to explain all the rules, but the idea is that you have a set of cards, and so you're building your own deck out of the cards. You're playing against someone else who's made their deck as well, so similar to other deck builder games. And just like a lot of these games are, there is some strategy involved with the types of cards that you put in your deck, but there's also a lot of luck involved in terms of the cards that you're drawing. And so what they're trying to do with that game is kind of level the playing field and make it so that there's more skill, I guess, involved in the building of the deck and less luck involved in the drawing. And so like creators of that type of game are trying to get that balance right. And I have to say I wouldn't be able to describe all the rules. I played once. I felt like I wasn't that skilled at it, and I lost the game.
Chad, you got one? You got one to share with us? Go ahead.
I recognize many of these games. I tend to play a couple of games again and again and again. So going back, I played this really, what would now be kind of considered, I think, minimalist game on my laptop towards the end of the school year called Royals, in which you are an aspiring non-royal, and the number of moves you're allowed to take in the game correspond to the kind of labor you do and your life expectancy, and how much you can amass things kind of quickly in your neck of the woods to enjoy kind of the fruits of your labor, but you can't ever really stop if you want to play the game to its stated end of becoming a royal, but I'm not sure you ever can. So I just like to make a house and rest there for a long time.
Kind of like in Minecraft.
Yeah, it's like 80s, maybe early 90s Minecraft. That's a good way to think about it.
Well, thanks everybody. We're starting to come down. It's 8:02, just a little over the hour. I know one of the games that I just remembered that I always play, right, is when you forget something, like a movie name or actor name, something like that, you can't Google it. You gotta ask the people around you. And I know we got the CLMOOC community going on now. I would challenge everybody to that. Like, you get to know people very much easier because you got an automatic icebreaker about, yeah, who's the guy who was in Heavyweights, in 1994. There's a couple people you can name. But we're going to go ahead and close this one out. We're going to try to keep the community rolling. Feel free to answer that Heavyweights question in the chat room as we go out. And any last words, final words from folks?
Yeah, I mean, I would just sincerest thanks to everybody on the chat and everybody who's joined into the live stream. I'm really excited to see what else people create and what my call to action would be. And I know there's a lot of call to actions in that newsletter, so I'm actually like, let me just add another one onto that game, another game piece. It would be to definitely take a look at what people are creating and make it into a multiplayer and tell us what you would do in that game. I think that would be really interesting.
And I just want to say thanks to everyone for having me on here and celebrate mistakes. Number one.
I'll encourage everybody to have a kitchen table game jam and just throw every board game you can find and every cast-off toy and every piece of crafting that you're using in the middle of a table, and with your nearest and dearest. Keep going until you make something that's fun for everyone that's sitting there.
Awesome, yeah, and thanks for letting me join this late, and I'm really looking forward to the games that come out of this week.
Thanks for letting me join later, and have fun. Make sure you're having fun when you're making stuff.
Cool, everybody. See you in the community on Twitter and all our channels, and in life too. You know, stay around. See you later. Oh.